Kemi Badenoch has just been elected as the leader of the Conservative Party.
Absolutely hopeless, totally divorced from real people's lives, doesn't understand the real world at all. Labour were making a big mistake if they underestimate her. Impetuous, not a people person. And the clip that was most being used was one where she talked about it's a bit like sex. If it's not messy, it's not working. This episode is powered by Fuse Energy. And Fuse, Rory, they are at it again. They've got another giveaway for anyone who switches their electricity at getfuse.com/politics and uses the referral code politics.
5 lucky switchers will win a copy of our books, Alastair, and we'll even sign them with a personal message too.
And that means if you've got children, we can do children's books. And if you've got adults, you want an adult's book, we do adult's book. And this is a great time to think about changing your electricity supplier to Fuse, because as of October the 1st, the energy price cap has gone up again. Average annual bill up 10%.
And Fuse's tariffs are cheaper than any of the big 6 competitors. So hopefully you'll be able to save on your electricity bill this winter if you switch. So go to getfuse.com/politics now to find out all the details.
And Fuse are a green electricity supplier. They generate power from their own solar and wind farms. They invest 100% of profits into building more renewables. So they really are trying to make a difference for the planet.
So download the Fuse app now and crucially use the referral code politics after signing up for a chance to win our books. Deadline for entry is 3rd November. Visit getfuse.com/politics to learn more.
It takes just 3 minutes to download the app and sign up, and Fuse will handle everything with your old electricity supplier for you. That's getfuse.com/politics.
Welcome to the Rest is Politics extra episode focused on the Conservative leadership campaign with me, Rory and Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell.
Yeah, Kemi Badenoch has just been elected as the leader of the Conservative Party. And it's something that would traditionally have been really, really big news. I mean, obviously, this is the party that has dominated British politics for 200 years. And she's now the leader of the opposition in Parliament. Before, though, we get into the nitty-gritty of the campaign, am I right in saying that it may not have got quite the coverage and focus and public enthusiasm that this thing might have got a few years ago, or is that just a perception?
I think in terms of public enthusiasm, yes. I don't think you get that many people sort of, talking about it as intensely as they might have done a few years ago. But it's led the news all day, and it's been getting a lot of commentary, and she'll become overnight pretty much a near household name in Britain. As she sort of develops in the job over the next few years, she'll become well known around the world. And I think also the fact that she's the first black leader of any of the major parties. She's the second Conservative leader of colour after Rishi Sunak, and she's the 4th woman. And of course, Labour have had neither, apart from 2 interim leaders, Margaret Beckett and Harriet Harman, have had neither a female leader nor a black leader. So that's getting a lot of interest. I think she'll try and play that down because, of course, she's very kind of anti the whole sort of what she calls the woke agenda. I know you're going to talk us through the process a bit, Rory, but let me just give you a few numbers to start off. So she got 53,806 votes. Robert Jenrick, the man she defeated in the final, 41,388. So it's the closest Tory leadership race of recent times. The result, when announced, revealed that the membership of your party has shrunk to 132,000, which is the lowest level ever. And it's 40,000 down since the last vote in 2022. She's the 6th Tory leader in 9 years. She's leading a party now of just 121 MPs. MP for North West Essex, and this is interesting. Her majority at the election, it was a new seat, but her previous seat was Saffron Walden, where she had a massive majority, well over 20,000. And the majority this time was 2,610. So that's kind of pretty marginal in modern language.
So just to remind listeners about this, and obviously I ran unsuccessfully for the Tory leadership myself, and broadly speaking, that the system hasn't changed. And I think it's quite important for our democracy to understand how this system works, because when we were in office, when the Conservatives were in office, this was literally the way a prime minister was chosen. And it's a way currently someone who has a good chance of being prime minister is chosen. So MPs nominate themselves to be the leader. And you can have a situation where it feels like the Grand National 12 or 13 MPs can nominate themselves. They're then whittled down, usually in rounds of voting, by the MPs themselves, the members of Parliament, the Conservative MPs, of whom, when I was in the House of Commons, there'd be 300 and something. Now there would be 129, right?
121.
121. And once they've got to the last two are then presented to the Conservative Party members in the country. And the number one big fact there is that when my mother was a member of the Conservative Party in the 1950s, there were 2.5 million members of the Conservative Party.
Amazing.
Today, as you've just pointed out, there are just over 100,000 members, and they are older and more right-wing than the general population. So one of the things that's happening, and this is an innovation, this wasn't traditionally the way that Conservative leaders were chosen, it was something brought in by William Hague. And he argued when he did it that it was making it more democratic. I would argue it made it much less democratic. Because at least the old system where they were selected by MPs, the MPs were directly elected by their constituents and had a mandate directly from the public as a whole. By giving it to the party members, it sounds democratic on the surface because there are more people involved, but actually it's a tiny, tiny percentage of the overall British population choosing somebody who, in the case of Boris Johnson or Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, became Prime Minister, or in the case of Kemi Badenoch becomes the leader. And so as you came to the last two, really what you found was a battle between Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch for the party members. Pretty high turnout, but about 70% of them voted.
I thought it was very low. Why would you be a member and not vote? I mean, honestly, what's the point? The only point of being a member is you get a vote in this damn thing. I thought that was unbelievably low turnout.
That is absolutely true.
Almost a third of the members couldn't be asked to vote for either of them.
Having paid your money, that's the only thing you pay, what your money every year to do. No, I agree. And she won by, I guess, about, if you put in percentage terms, about 55% to 45%. There was extraordinary spinning, as you can imagine, in the week or two running in. So you could see Philip Blond, for example, who's a academic and red Tory commentator, saying that Robert Jenrick was going to get all the support from the north, but Kemi Badenoch was going to get the wet liberal support, which was obviously an attempt to try to play into the hands of the right wing of the party. He was a Jenrick supporter. But it turned out in the end that she had a very strong position. And I suppose two final things before I hand back to you. She was elected to Parliament first in 2017. So she's been in Parliament for a very, very short period. I came in 2010, and I remember Kemi arriving in 2017. Very, very kind of bright-eyed, bushy, likable, enthusiastic. But she came in after Brexit. So she's part of a whole generation of MPs that didn't even go through the kind of misery of the Brexit referendum. She never saw David Cameron in office. She came in when Theresa May had, on the election where Theresa May lost her majority. And so she really, her whole experience of politics has been what, for the Conservative Party, has been one of the most miserable periods in Conservative Party history, the period of Boris Johnson's implosion, COVID, which locked down Parliament, where they barely saw each other for a couple of years, the embarrassment of Liz Truss, and now the worst Conservative defeat almost on record under Rishi Sunak. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that formation, not in very long, and what she's seen as a Conservative Party tearing itself to pieces.
Yeah. No, listen, she's got a big challenge on her hands, no doubt about that. There was some of the news bulletins were playing clips from her maiden speech. And as you say, she's only been an MP for a few years. And the clip that was most being used was one where she talked about it's a bit like sex. If it's not messy, it's not working. And that's all. That's the only bit I saw. I don't know whether I don't even know what the issue was. So I don't know if you remember her maiden speech, Rory, but
I think presumably it was a reference to Brexit, isn't it?
Either it was Brexit or it's politics or it's parliamentary procedure. I don't know. And I suppose I should have maybe looked up the whole thing. But I guess what that revealed to me is the one thing she's always been very, very good at is getting attention and finding the sort of, the phrase and a bit Johnsonian, really. She's sort of, and I see he said that she's going to bring a bit, what was it, zip and zap or zang and zip or zang and something or other. He came up with some ridiculous new phrase today. I have been ringing around a few of the MPs that I know, and it has been really interesting, actually, because there's such a variation of view.
And you've spoken, you say, to 10% of the Conservative Party,
I'm into double figures. I'm into double figures.
Yeah,
And there are
on,
only 121,
yeah,
so
yeah,
I'm almost 10%. Yeah.
yeah.
I would say the views vary from, and it won't be surprise you to know that most of the Tories that I know are your sort of Tories.
Yeah.
There aren't that many of them left.
Except, of course, for David Davis and all your mates like that.
But I do know some on the right as well. And I've also talked to a couple who lost their seat. And I think the general view is that she has emerged as the best of a not very good bunch. I was very surprised how much people felt that actually, you and I, when we were doing our live shows and Cleverly, everybody was saying it should be Cleverly. I got the feeling of the MPs that they didn't think that would have been a good outcome.
Right.
And they thought that she was the best of those who put her name forward. The general view I got was that generally it would have been a disaster, that they felt he was pandering so far to the right that there might as well be reform already.
Okay.
One of the people who did vote for her, not first time around, but voted for her from the third vote onwards, said she is right wing, but she's not crazy, which is why she avoided the whole ECHR debate, the European Convention withdrawal or not debate. And they also said, and he said to me, you should be very pleased about this because you're always going on about the importance of sticking to strategy. Her strategy was to avoid too much specific policy.
Which is sort of Ming Vase, right?
It is a bit Ming Vase-ish. It was making it all about positioning rather than specific policy. And it's interesting, you mentioned David Cameron. I hadn't realised with this, but when David Cameron became leader, he set up these 5 policy commissions. And she was on one of them, even though she was not in Parliament. She was on the one that was chaired by Peter Lilly about globalisation.
Which I remember, which Bob Geldof was part of too. I did quite a lot with that, yeah. I remember.
Yeah. So one of the people I talked to who is quite close to her said that he thinks she will take that sort of approach to policy, have a very long-term approach to policy development, really come in hard from the start as a campaigning opposition leader. Said to me, for example, you and I talked about the farms issue on the inheritance tax and small farms on the main podcast this week. Said, I bet you that will be her first big campaign. So we shall see. So deliberately avoided policy, deliberately avoided specific policy. And even though people were saying this was a mistake, she stuck to that strategy. But then on the other side, I had one who said, absolutely hopeless, totally divorced from real people's lives, doesn't understand the real world at all. Somebody else said, very clever, very astute, not to be underestimated. Labour were making a big mistake if they underestimate her. Somebody else said, not fully formed, but very mouldable. Lots of them talked about her temperament, impetuous, not a people person. And one said, she doesn't suffer fools gladly, which when you're leading Tory MPs is a major handicap. The general feeling I got was that although they think the whole thing has lasted too long and it's not been very exciting and it hasn't caught the public imagination at all, that if you're going to pick a leader at this time to make life difficult for Labour, which is part of the job, then far better to have her than Robert Jenrick. That was the kind of general view I got.
I've been thinking about this a little bit. One thing that we've not done, and maybe if we geekily going to do at some point, is to do a really detailed analysis of who the Conservative MPs left in the House of Commons are. I mean, one of the striking things for me is that with the exception of Jeremy Hunt, none of the really big beasts of the David Cameron or Theresa May cabinets are still in Parliament at all. There are a few of the kind of old guard, but many fewer than there would have been. I mean, I think we've talked about this, but the big difference traditionally between the British Parliament and, for example, the Dutch Parliament, where the oldest member of Parliament is Geert Wilders, the right-wing politician who's only been in since 1997, and the British Parliament traditionally, people hung around for 30, 40 years, and there are a few of those still left in the Conservative Party. So people like John Whittingdale, Ian Duncan Smith, still around. But broadly speaking, it's a very, very new parliament.
Yeah.
And of those who've been in longer, they were not the big secretaries of state under Cameron or May. So it's going to be very interesting seeing how she forms it. I noticed amongst her last minute endorsers, She managed to go all the way from people like Harriet Baldwin, who would be traditionally more on the left of the party and was a supporter of Jeremy Hunt, over to Geoffrey Cox, who people might remember as the kind of
The voice.
fruity-voiced Attorney General who was more on the Brexit side. Can I just give a quick introduction to who she is? I mean, people who've been following the news will have got a little bit of this, but what's interesting about her is that although she was born in Britain, she left Britain when she was very, very young, little baby, and lived largely in Nigeria, a little bit in the US, till she was 16. Her father was a doctor. Her mother was a professor of physiology. She's from the Yoruba community in Nigeria. And that meant that when she was on that commission that Cameron set up to look into international development, she was quite unusual. And I felt this in Parliament in having spent 16 years of her life growing up in a developing country. I mean, she has, in a way that very few MPs do, an instinct for the rest of the world. I mean, many, many MPs increasingly are quite parochial. They've grown up in small towns. They've become councillors. They've joined parties quite young. They haven't travelled very much. She does have an instinctive understanding for the world outside the United Kingdom, and she's been quite interesting in using that. I wondered whether it was a good strategy to give a lot of speeches saying, Britain's much better than Nigeria, and I grew up in a country which had no electricity and a lot of crime, and I thought that was a sort of, people might feel, well, that's a bit irrelevant and it doesn't touch their lives much because they can't really relate to what it's like growing up in Nigeria. But in fact, it was fine. It worked fine for it.
Just a bit on the point of the team. I can't remember what the final number of ministers that there are in the government, but it's in 3 figures. Once you take all the sort of junior ministers and so forth, right? The whole front bench. She's only just got over 3 figures, 121. So she'd probably have to have a sort of slimmed down shadow team to some extent. There are some, I'm just looking through the list now, Gavin Williamson's still there, Andrew Mitchell, as you say, still there, Priti Patel's still there. I wouldn't be surprised if you put Priti Patel back where she was before, at the Home Office, shadow Home Office. Will she give a big job to Tom Tugendhat? Might he go somewhere in the sort of foreign affairs defence area? You've got people like Laura Trott, Claire Coutinho, Caroline Noakes, Julian Smith, who was the very good Northern Ireland secretary, I thought.
I'm a real fan of Julian, and it would be good to see him back in a serious position, doing serious stuff.
Victoria Atkins had been on the front bench.
Yeah, and I'd like to see Mel Stride, Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly used properly.
The other thing that MPs are saying to me tonight is that they genuinely feel that they're back in the game in a way that they didn't think they would be for a long, long, long time. Now, they may be just sort of whistling in the wind on that, but they basically think that Labour's got off to a terrible start. Now, I think they may be overstating it, but, you can see why. And one of them said, for example, I thought when we lost the election, we're going to be out for at least 3 terms. I'm not sure about that anymore. But I'm still not sure that the Tory party is ready to settle down, because the truth is, one of the other MPs said to me that, the most important appointment is not going to be Shadow Foreign Secretary, not going to be Shadow Chancellor, it's going to be the Chief Whip, because the Chief Whip is going to have the job of holding all these different factions together. Because even though it's a smaller number, it's still a pretty factionalised party. That's what she's going to have to get on top of. And it's going to be very, very hard to do that while you're trying to set a new policy direction.
As we've often discussed, we're in a world of anti-incumbency. I mean, I hadn't realised in Australia that every party winning an election had run 2 terms since something like 1931. And yet there's a possibility that this Labour government here is going to lose after 1 term. And although when we've been going around the country, everybody's pretty confident that Labour in Britain will win 2 terms, I'm not sure in the modern world where people get impatient so quickly, and where social media drives an enormous amount of that rage and anti-incumbency, whether that isn't an opportunity. I think the second thing is that she clearly has a form of charisma. She's very, very, on a personal level, very likable, engaging. There's something very special about somebody who was able to run credibly for the leadership first she thought of running in 2019, but she ran when Johnson stepped down, and she managed to beat, even in that one, that was the one that ended up as the standoff between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. But even there, she beat Sajid Javid, Grant Shapps, Jeremy Hunt, Nadim Zahawi, Tom Tugendhat, and made it into the last 4 when she'd only been in Parliament. She'd never been in the cabinet. She'd only been a very junior minister. She's really got people like Michael Gove behind her. And that's partly because it's not just that she's bright and sparky, but she was very loyal to him during his leadership campaign, and people appreciate that. And I guess the Conservative Party also senses that we're in a more populist, raw age, and they're slightly missing the more electorally palatable bits. I'm coming up with a sort of horrid, pompous way of saying they're missing bits of Boris Johnson I didn't like, but they are looking for that kind of secret sauce where they feel people can whip up the conversation, get the attention, get things going. Now, of course, that can go horribly wrong. It went horribly wrong, Boris Johnson. And of course, Liz Truss was a big person for getting media headlines for saying outspoken things and being outrageous. And that didn't, in the end, work out well.
There's no doubt she's better at capturing media attention. And she does have people like Gove and his entourage who help on that. But she does make mistakes. And, I think she acknowledges that she made a very bad mistake when she talked about maternity pay. She's sort of very dismissive of maternity pay. Well, when you're married to a very, very wealthy investment banker called Hamish, then, you probably don't have to worry about it as much as other people do. I thought what she said about autism during the election campaign was awful. Essentially saying that, autistic kids get special treatment. Which I think you'd be really hard pressed to set that up against a factual analysis. Very dismissive of the minimum wage. Said that had that throwaway remark about 10% of civil servants ought to be in prison. A bit Trumpian on that. And maybe, as you say, maybe that's what works in politics, but I think she's going to have to be very, very careful. One of the people I spoke to is quite close to her, said that she's not going to go down this whole sort of woke agenda the whole time. That was what she was doing when she was Equalities Minister, because she felt that was her job. But I don't think she'll be able to resist on some of the sort of the culture war touch button issues. That I think she'll find that she'll go down that road. And I think there's a sort of danger, I think, in our politics. I don't think we're yet like the United States. I hope to God we're not. By the way, the one way where I do hope like the United States, Rory, I hope that by Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we'll be able to say, well, what a week that was for black women in politics.
Hear to that.
One's the leader of the Tory party in Britain, and the other was just to become president. I also talked to a couple of Labour people about her. There was one Labour MP, in fact, quite a few Labour MPs were tweeting, early Christmas present for Labour. And I always go, I don't think you should do that stuff.
Where do they do it, incidentally? Because I recognise that. That's a sort of trope, isn't it? What is it that they think they're doing when they're doing that?
Well, they think they're saying...
Well, they're trying to set the agenda, aren't they? They're trying to...
Yeah, they're trying to say that nothing to worry about, not up to it. And I think you should take the opposite approach. I think you should actually say, okay, this person... I've been very dismissive of both Badenoch and Jenrick. But I think once, she's there now, and you really have to think about how she's got there, why she's got there, why has she been able to win, as you say, coming from, virtually a standing start a few years ago. And so one of the more thoughtful people on the Labour side, said, not to be underestimated, very, very pugnacious, very tough, quite thoughtful, more thoughtful maybe than people realise. But where she has real vulnerabilities is on her economic views, I think, are way out of kilter where most of the country are. And she could slip into this culture war stuff. And you're not going to outflank Farage on this stuff. So you've got to be... And interestingly, one of these MPs, Roy, I don't know if you know this, told me that John Curtis, one of our favourite pollsters, did a presentation to the Tory MPs before the last election where he showed them the data showing that every time that they went off on sort of highlighting immigration as the big issue, the big challenge, politically, the people who benefited from that were Reform. In other words, you're playing their game for them. And this guy, who's on the right of the party, by the way, pointed out to me that there are way more, like there's double the number of Tory voters who would say that their alternative vote would go to the Lib Dems.
I wonder what challenge it makes for Starmer. One of the things that has been true is that until the budget, obviously Labour had a very difficult period of a few weeks where it was struggling to define itself. I think the budget has given a new sense of clarity because it was a big, bold budget. But you have had the sense that they've been lacking a good conservative bogeyman to go after. good Conservative opponent to go after, and that was quite important for the Labour victory to have these sort of horrible Tories. And one of the reasons that Labour won so well is people wanted to get rid of the Tories. So they will be hoping to have a Conservative Party they can point to in the House of Commons and in the country and say, at least you're not getting this lot.
Yeah.
And I think they may find it trickier with Kemi Badenoch than they might have done with Robert Jenrick, who did seem, as you say, more out of central casting as a kind of middle-aged, white, middle-class conservative man. Keir Starmer's going to have to be very careful not to come across as kind of patronizing when dealing with Kemi Badenoch, because that's one of her superpowers. She's very good at turning around people who try to patronize her.
Some Labour MPs sort of put the boot in straight away. They went on about the stuff that I've been talking about, what she said about autism, what she said about maternity pay, the fact she had admitted hacking into Harriet Harman's website in the past and sort of faking stuff on that. The allegations of bullying that have been swamping around. So all that's going to sort of come out. But Keir Starmer's put out a post. It just said, the first black leader of a Westminster party is a proud moment for our country. I look forward to working with you and your party in the interests of the British people. I wondered whether he'd been listening to our leading interview with George Mitchell, talking about his relationship with Bob Dole when they were the leaders in the Senate. What I think he's doing there is just saying, right, stay right out of the politics until it's a little bit clearer what she's going to do, and just genuinely welcome the fact that it is historic when you have the first black leader of a Westminster party.
It's pretty cool. And I'm not sure, again, without being too over the top, there's not very many countries in the world where somebody who, she describes herself as being effectively a first-generation immigrant. I mean, really, she came to Britain first time in her memory, really, when she was 16.
Yeah,
I'm not sure there's many countries in the world that would have been able to make that story feel so easy. And I think it tells you a lot about the Conservative Party, because I think there would have been an easy, lazy view, which is, obviously they're going to vote for Jenrick because in the end they're basically racist and chauvinist. And I must confess to having had temptations to that myself, because definitely there are older members of the Conservative Party who I think would not be comfortable with a black woman. But the fact is, they made the decision, and they can be quite kind of beady-eyed and ruthless, and they've done it because they suspect she is their best chance of winning. She's their best chance of finding a message that comes home. And given that one of the challenges that Kamala Harris is likely to face in the US election is the fact that she's a black woman, and that will be one of the reasons why many right-wing American men do not vote for her. I think it's quite encouraging that our major right-wing party is so comfortable bringing a black woman in as its leader.
Yeah, and following Rishi Sunak, who, in his last appearance in the Commons as leader, said that the most remarkable thing he felt when he became leader was that his skin colour wasn't that big a deal. I do wonder, though, whether there was an element of racism against him in some of the votes in the UK election.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. You won't meet people who necessarily admit that, but you don't know. The most important thing for Labour is to stop the kind of missteps that we've seen in the early days, really, really focus on the big stuff that we saw in the budget and drive that through. And the country's got to improve. There's no doubt about that. The public service has got to improve. People's living standards have got to improve. They've got to deliver. And then, in a way, let the Tories are going to have to sort themselves out. Labour can't influence that too much. I think she will struggle to unite all these different factions around a coherent policy agenda. I think if they're being sensible, their strategy for Farage and reform, effectively in public presentation terms, should be to ignore them as much as they can and just let them do their own thing. Farage he was straight out the traps, had a piece in the Telegraph within minutes basically saying, yet another Tory who's kind of sold out real conservatism, blah, blah, blah. So he's going to do that. Let him do that. The fact of being relatively new means she can shape the agenda. And then it's a question of whether she's got the political and personal skills to do that. I've seen nothing from her that says to me that she's going to be special. I think she should be very wary of all this comparison with Thatcher. I think that's always a dangerous thing. And don't forget as well, Thatcher was surrounded by some really, really, really heavyweight politicians. And that's
Yeah.
not just looking back saying they were
Yeah.
heavyweight. I mean, they
Yeah.
were. People like Keith Joseph, Nigel Lawson, Willie Whitelaw, Geoffrey Howe, Michael Heseltine. These were big, big, big political figures. She doesn't have many of them in this very, very shallow pool of Tory MPs.
She doesn't, but I think she has a potential now to build quite an interesting new shadow cabinet. And it'd be very interesting, I think, to see more Conservative women. I think looking down the list of the MPs, there are some really interesting, talented Conservative women. So she could provide quite a strong, surprising cabinet with some new faces. I mean, I'd love, as I say, to see some of the good older figures. I mean, there are people who I really rated when I was still in Parliament. So Damien Hines, Mel Stride, Jesse Norman, these are all very, very capable people. As I say, I think Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly have things, but there are also some very interesting young Conservative women who I think could provide quite a challenge to Labour. And I think the real trick here is to produce the most talented, interesting cabinet she possibly can.
Yeah, but in the end, Rory, it's about the policies they bring forward and the ideas that they have. Let's just finally, though, plug on election night, you will be further offending those who think your carbon footprint is already too large by flying from Australia to New York. I will be joining you. We'll be meeting up with the Mooch, Anthony Scaramucci, and with Marina Hyde from The Rest is Entertainment, and with Dominic Sambrook from The Rest is History. And we'll be taking people through what will probably be the most consequential of all of the elections that we've talked about this year.
It's going to be quite exciting. We have a great cast of people. We've got some amazing guests coming on. We're going to do it straight onto YouTube. So it'll be, I hope, a really engaging, interesting thing. People like Dominic Sambrook are going to bring amazing historical analysis. We're going to have some terrific, unexpected US guests coming in and out. And I think it'll be an exciting way of challenging the big British broadcasters for US election coverage. So do please tune in during the night and see our different YouTube sections as the election unfolds.
We're actually the first of our 3 long sessions is going to kick off 8 p.m. UK time, where we'll just have hours to talk over the past, the future, the present, the campaign, the way it's gone, all sorts of things. So for more information, just search The Rest is Politics, America Decides on YouTube. The shows will also be available to watch afterwards on Spotify. You just have to search The Rest is Politics US Election Video Special.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Alastair. Thanks for staying up so late at night, and thanks to the team also. And very, very interesting to have Kemi Badenoch as the new Conservative leader. See you soon.
See you, bye.